Multi-generational family issues. What does that mean? Well, there's a wonderful movie called The Shipping News. Any of you here seen it? Of course not.
Kevin Spacey?
Kevin Spacey. Did you see it?
Yeah, a long time ago.
Okay. We have someone who's seen the movie. And since I want you to know, those of you out there in YouTube land, I want you to know that there really are some people here. Speak up and tell us about the movie.
I don't remember the movie. I've seen it with Julianne Moore and I just don't
Kevin Spacey. And you can get the high spots of the plot. Kate Blanchett is in it too, by the way.
I don't remember.
Okay, remember the guy Coyle? He's kind of a lump, Kevin Spacey. You know, he goes from a series of bad jobs. He's just one of these people who, he doesn't really participate in life, he just kind of endures it. And the movie opens fairly early with his father, who was, to use a colloquialism, a real hard ass, throwing him off of a dock to teach him how to swim. And while he's like drowning in the water, like, oh, you know, it's like, come on, boy, you can do better than that. You know. But none of us are raised that way now, right? We all have loving parents who are like, now come on, I'm going to let you in. This is how you do it. No, a lot of people don't have benefit of that. They just get thrown into the water of life and, well, you can sink or swim, you little jerk. I'm tired of feeding you anyway. And that's how a lot of people get brought up. Whether they want to be or not, that's what it is. So here was this guy played by Kevin Spacey named Coyle. And he was kind of chronically depressed and not just real happy guy. And one day Kate Blanchett literally bumps into his life, jumps in his car and says, start driving, to leave the man she's been living with. And they end up hanging out and they have a kid together, and then she decides to leave him and sell the kid, by the way, on the black market, so she'll have cash to leave with her new boyfriend. And she comes to an untimely end, fortunately after she sold the kid, so the kid didn't die with her and her new boyfriend. And so now Kevin Spacey is left with a daughter to raise, and his wife is dead, and he's like, and Judi Dench arrives at his door and says, I'm your aunt, your brother's half-sister. Excuse me, your father's half-sister. And he's like going, father's half-sister? I never knew he had a half-sister. Well, she's on her way back to Newfoundland, where they're all from. And as she says, it's kind of like an itch you've got to scratch. And I will tell you, this multi-generational family stuff is the same thing. And what basically happens is, I'm going to try to illustrate this on this board. It's the best audio visual I've got. And I was never a great artist, but here goes. Let's say in your parents' time, grandparents' time, your grandparents' time, there were wars, floods, marital strife, affairs, kids they didn't want to account for. Let's see, what else? And other forms of trauma. Oh, don't forget, rape and incest. All the things that we just love to talk about and think about and have conversation over the dining table, right?
And the Great Depression.
Well, the Great Depression in the 30s, yeah, it was really hard times. And people had to struggle. You know, it was Paper Moon was a great movie about some guy who kind of gets saddled with the daughter he wanted to forget about. And this one, my My mother's mother was the local midwife in the little community in rural North Georgia. And she told me about how one day she was about 10, 11 years old, and one of the girls from one of the big families over the next hill, Miss Nan, come quick! Sally's got the bellyache! So they all ran over to the house. I can't say the name. I could say the name, but I won't. And there was the 12-year-old daughter with her father standing there, you know, like, you gonna take all day, gal? You know, squatting behind the barn delivering a baby that someone had impregnated her with. Either one of her brothers or her father, or who knows. These are all white folks, by the way. It doesn't get any crazier than white trash, trust me. Anyway, so she delivered the baby, they cut the cord, they didn't tie the cord, so the baby bled to death, and her father and an uncle, or grandfather, somebody, all took it out to like somewhere out on the back corner of the property where they buried it in a shallow, unmarked grave, and nobody ever talked about it again. Now, if your family's been in this country 3 or 4 generations, and especially if they spend any time in a rural area, there's some of this going on. I had another client come to me years ago. She was the oldest child. Her father, she had figured out she had a problem with female authority figures. She'd just gotten fired by a woman boss, and she said, you know, every time I ever try to work for a woman, it's always a disaster, and something's going on, but I can't figure out what it is. And of course, she wanted to focus on the job and this woman, and blah, 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 and she was just in the middle of going on about, and unfair, and I got this intuition, and I looked at her, I said, you were molested when you were young, weren't you? Why would you say a thing like that? I said, I don't know. I just picked it up, the vibe. And she kind of squirmed a little. She said, well, yeah, as a matter of fact, I was, but I don't usually talk about it. But why would you pick up on something that fast? And I said, well, you know, I kind of do. I mean, don't take it personally. It's just, I do. It's a blessing, it's a curse, I do. So as the story unfolded, she explained that her father was involved in an industry where there's a lot of mentoring, and you sort of sign on with somebody, and then you take their abuse for a number of years, and then when that's done, you become well off and well respected, and then you can assume a well-paying position within that industry. And so he had been taken under his wing by this boss, who they would have over for dinner on Sundays a couple of times a month. And after dinner, she was about 8, 9, 10. After dinner, everybody would kind of go look for a place to take a nap. And they had a pretty big house, and the boss would come and find her and take her to a kind of remote part of the house, and then fiddle with her for a couple of hours. Molestation. And this went on for a couple of years. Now, and I want to use her, by the way, or her story, as the second generation, which I sort of call the question mark, because she had this happening to her, this rape and incest. Now, normally, finally, she got to be about 10 or 11, and she just couldn't take it anymore, and she did what she went and told her mother. Mom basically said, well, he's your father's boss, and if you think we're going to jeopardize your father's career over this, you got another thing coming. And besides, it happens to girls and women. Get used to it. It happened to me, and I survived. And of course, from my perspective, I'm like, yeah, you survived all right, but you're still pretty ticked off about it. And of course, who do you take that anger out on? You take it out on the kid who's reminding you of what you've buried and how powerless and helpless you were when it happened to you. And you're basically saying, suck it up, kid, that's life. Now, that dynamic happens over and over and over again in families. My father graduated high school in 1929. He went off to college so that he could start his college career, and he was at the University of Florida for about a month waiting for his check to come so he could pay his fees, etc. And finally his parents called him up and said, you're going to have to pack up and come home because we lost all our money in the stock market crash and we can't send you any money, and in fact if you don't come home and get a job we're probably going to lose the house. So here's an example of a deep wound in my father's psyche, a betrayal by his parents. Granted, it was an unusual occurrence, but it happened to a lot of people. And because he was never able to go to college, how do you think he had this trauma, okay, etc.? How do you think he responded to my brother and I going to college? Well, if you've appropriately grieved a loss, if you've done the denial, the anger, the bargaining, the depression, and the acceptance, and let it go, and then you have the more loving parental response is, I want my kids to have what I didn't have. That's the whole reason I'm knocking myself out. But if you're the survivor of parents who still have all this trauma, but they're not talking about it, they're not dealing with it, then you're what we call an adult survivor. In other words, you're physically an adult, but in your child, you're still a child attached to your parents' trauma that they're still stuck in. And probably will be for the rest of their lives, by the way, because it's just too painful. And in most older generations, the idea of going to therapy is only what crazy people do. Not us. We have a job. We function. We do everything we're supposed to do. We don't need therapy. So, but unconsciously, you have a resentment. So my father's attitude initially was, oh, I want you to go to college. But then we went to college, but he wanted us to be business majors. My brother didn't want to be a business major. I didn't want to be a business major because that was not our dream. That was his dream. So both of us got 2 years. And after that, we were on our own. And his attitude was, well, it's 2 years more than I got. Deal with it. His favorite expression, which I hate to say, sometimes I hear myself repeat, is, there's folks in hell that want ice water. Get over it. Because that's how people of his generation dealt with trauma. And the reality is sometimes that's the only way we get to deal with trauma. And if it's relatively minor stuff, you know, Whoopi Goldberg does this in her first comedy skit in '85. She talked about, you know, the things that drove her crazy, like, why can't I get an American Express card? Why can't I get someone to deal with my coif? She said, and then you go to the Anne Frank house and you put your card and your coif up next to life and death, and you suddenly understand the meaning of Trivial Pursuit. Okay, so I want to be very clear about the fact that this multi-generational thing has to do with major issues. And most people who grew up in the Depression or who were young adults in the Depression and then had to deal with World War II, etc., they don't respond to any of this stuff. It's like you tough it out, you move forward, and if you're a weak person, you have a nervous breakdown and you deserve whatever happens to you. And that's how they would deal with trauma and loss and rape and incest and all the other stuff. So my friend's parents' response, while it was cold and harsh, was pretty normal. You know, her mother said, look, get over it. I did. We're not going to sacrifice our career for you because you're going to go down with us. And, you know, that's how some people deal with trauma. The problem was my friend had now absorbed not only her own rape and incest at the hands of this guy, but all the coping mechanisms of her parents, which were basically non-existent. So she's got 2 layers of this issue to deal with. Because not only is she left holding the bag, but there's no one in her family to tell her how to deal with it, except put it on your shoulder and walk with it, kid. That's what we had to do. Now, again, there's no right or wrong with this per se. The problem is the load is twice as heavy. And then, of course, what I see, not with this person, but with a lot of other people is, they have kids. Now, this particular person got therapy, got some healing, got some insight, realized she was mad as hell at her mother, which is why she had problems dealing with women and women supervisors. But she was mad as hell at her mother for basically selling her out and betraying her and not protecting her as a child. But then she was able to take the next step and realize that her mother was a victim too. And this is one of the beautiful things about therapy and healing, is if you engage the anger and the betrayal and the violence, what you always come to conclude is, you know, who do you blame? Because most of this stuff goes back to things like the Civil War, coming to America, the socio-economic racial disparities of our society. I mean, you know, if you want to blame somebody, it's blame the devil, you know, it's just life. Awful things happen to good people every day. Every day. Which is why it's really important not to feel guilt or shame about them and blame yourself. But unfortunately, the reason we do feel guilt or shame is because by blaming ourselves, we can create the illusion that somehow we have some control over all this stuff. Like, well, at least if I wear my seatbelt, I might survive getting run over by a Mack truck. But if you don't have your seatbelt on, you deserve whatever you get. See, I mean, this is the kind of thing that we do in our brains to try to make all this stuff normal. There's nothing normal about it. But what happens is, and I see this one in families all the time, and this is where it gets really twisted. Say you take a hypothetical grandmother who had to deal with this to survive, okay? And then the daughter who had to deal with this again, and then she has a couple of kids, but maybe the first husband leaves, and now she's got a second husband that she latched onto because mostly he was a good provider, and well, she wasn't really in love with him, but you know, he's presentable and he brings home a good paycheck, so what the heck. There's only one problem. Mom is now getting on in years, and he's getting to look around like, and he sees that stepdaughter. And mom makes it completely okay, looks the other way. Now, in the Tyler Perry movie, I think it was Medea's Family Reunion, one of the subplots is this exact scenario. And it's very common in our society, much more than most people want to admit. Now, it's not the only case. Parents offer up children all the time. Beat the kid. Just don't lay a hand on me. Stepchildren in particular get offered up all the time. Dad's gone, I don't really care that much, he's kind of a pain. Yeah, he's always fighting with my new husband, blah, 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 blah. and nobody knows what to do. The new husband doesn't want to discipline the child because it's not really his. Mom doesn't really know what to do because the kid reminds her of the husband that was a jerk and she left. She can't admit that openly because it's her kid. And no mother should ever feel that way about their child. That's a shameful place to go. So everybody just sort of does this dance, and in the meanwhile, the stepkid just gets lost and becomes a mess. So this is an example of this multi-generational stuff. In family systems theory, we do this thing called a genogram. And these are also pretty extreme examples I've talked about before, but a genogram is a way to do this in a much more sort of systemic and less dramatic fashion. And it's basically like a family tree. You know, you chart down mom and dad and where they came from and, you know, kids and that sort of stuff, except the other thing you do is you put in everybody, the additional husbands or wives or the additional stepchildren or half brothers or sisters or that sort of thing. Now, when I was taking my coursework from my family therapy licensure, we had to do a genogram. And by the way, there's books about genograms. It's a fairly... You can get very extensive and very detailed. I had to do a genogram on my family because that's what we do. You know, like, you know your family best, so map them out. My father was an only child. His mother, I knew about the 3 men in her life at that point, not much else. My mother was the next to youngest of 6 siblings. The oldest was a boy, the rest were all girls. And I knew about her mother, but I did not know about all the multiple husbands at the time. But I sat down and wrote out this genogram with all the aunts and the cousins and the nieces and the nephews and everybody else. And at the end, I ended up with this constellation with about 15 women in it. All but 2, my mother and 1 cousin, were married at least twice, and over half of them 3 or more times. So when I looked at that, I just kind of went, wow, nobody in this family knows how to have a successful, intimate relationship. It's not in our family thing, you know. As opposed to families where a divorce or a separation is the exception to the rule. In my family, it is the rule. Okay? Well, as I've thought about that over the years, I've realized, and especially when I found out that basically the whole family are sort of bastards, scallywags, and other kinds of survivors, quote unquote, what I realized is this is a whole group of people who don't really trust anyone or let anybody get too close. And ironically, the reason why my parents' marriage lasted 53 years is because both of them never wanted to talk about genuinely intimate things like emotions, which goes back to the don't feel, don't talk about it no matter what, and we're only as sick as our secrets. So for them, not talking about it, keeping the secret, and honoring the other person's secret. Like, okay, I know I've been married to you 40 years, and there's stuff you just don't talk about. You know it, but you don't talk about it. Well, that's okay. Because I have my own stuff I don't talk about. See, my father would occasionally, when he was mad at my mother, say, I don't understand her whole family. I've never seen a family like that before. They act like they're not really related to each other. Well, without realizing it, he had figured out, well, halfway, they're not related to each other, see? But this is the kind of stuff that your intuition can tell you if you're listening, even though your logic will go like, well, that doesn't make any sense. So this multi-generational issue, and of course, You know, my brother, God bless him, he's had 3 unsuccessful relationships. He's trying for a 4th. Hopefully it'll be more successful than the last ones. I have my own version of unsuccessful relationships. But I finally figured out, after years of blaming myself and feeling a lot of shame about, I don't have a relationship, and I finally realized, you know, I'm not really sure I want a relationship given all this history, you know, that I walk around with. I, of course, keep waiting for the exception to the rule, but I suspect that I am the rule and I am the exception. But the main thing is I don't agonize over it anymore. I don't blame myself. I don't have a lot of guilt or shame. It's just like, well, it's what it is. And given the family history, what else could it have been? So that's the multi-generational stuff. So in terms of the tools to sort of work through therapy-related issues, part of what I urge people to do is learn as much about your family history as you can. My friend, for example, and I forgot to mention this, discovered not only did her mother, you know, have the cold-hearted attitude she had, but then I asked her, I said, so how long was it between when your parents got married and you were born? And she said, well, I don't really know. They never talked about it. So she went and found out that it was 7 months. So then she went and talked to an aunt of hers, one of her mother's sisters, who basically said, oh, I'm glad you finally asked. I never wanted to tell you because I didn't want to be intrusive. But here's the real story. Your father knocked your mother up in college. She had to quit school because she was pregnant and had you. She eventually went back to school so she could start her own career, but basically she spent her whole life referring to you, when you weren't around, as the little bitch who ruined my life. Now, obviously, she didn't hate you completely because you were her daughter, but she had a lot of anger and resentment. And my brother actually dated a woman for a while who had a similar issue, and her mother was just, like 40 years later, just still mean as a... And I've seen that pattern a few times in my practice, where a woman would have a daughter and sort of the relationship was, don't be a sucker like I was. And then she would try to toughen the daughter up by basically being emotionally abusive. And the poor kid is going like, all I want is an ice cream cone. How come I'm such an awful little person because I asked you for an ice cream cone or a Barbie doll or whatever, you know? And a lot of that kind of stuff happens in families as well, where this big secret that nobody talks about, particularly relative to a particular child. I've had clients come in and they discover that they really weren't their father's child. They were the child that their mother had with an affair while she was separated from the father for a short period of time. And everybody's acted as if everything's normal, but the kid will go home and say, I don't look like her, I don't look like him. Something doesn't add up here. But nobody wants to talk about it because that's not polite conversation. And then eventually they will find a family member who will explain the secret, and then everything makes sense. Everything drops into place. But these are the kinds of things that happen within families that don't get talked about, and then the child grows up blaming themselves and believing they're flawed, they're shamed, they're inherently bad because they can never please their parents. And in fact, it has nothing to do with them at all. It has to do with something their parents can't deal with and they don't want to talk about. So this is why talking about all these issues is so important, and learning to talk about them. And one of the things we do in therapy is learn to talk about these kinds of things with as little judgment as possible so that people can stop blaming themselves and stop feeling shame and just realize, hey, this is just part of life and you got caught up in it. And it doesn't make you a bad person, but it probably does make you a survivor. And give yourself a little credit for that, because in spite of all of this, you've managed to make a life. So we can take a break on that one. Thank you.